Thank you, Tony. We were all breathing the same air right there. Wow. The breath, the one thing that binds all life, all creation, that reminds us that we come from the same source, that reminds us that there is more than just this sense of separate self, right? Because with every inhale and every exhale, it is proven that we are one with that which is expanding around us. If you take a moment and try not to breathe, you'll realize that moment won't last very long, will it? And in fact, a lot of people like to say it's not even that you're breathing, but you're being breathed. There's not much we can do about that. It's coming in and it's coming out, magnificently reminding us in each moment that we are one, we are whole, and we are more than what meets the eye. So today we're going to explore an idea that you may have contemplated in your life. You may have heard other ideas about this idea that may have resonated or not resonated. It may be an idea that you just kind of threw out, like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, throwing out an old-style religion term. But how long has it been since you've contemplated the will of God? The will of God. What is the will of God? And are we here to do the will of God? And if there is such a concept called the will of God, then what is your personal will? And can that counter the will of God? Just breathe into your thoughts on this idea for a moment. Breathe into the language in your consciousness. It may be the language of your spiritual upbringing. It may be the language of your inheritance. It may be the language of your education. But where do you stand on this concept of your will and the will of God? In Unity, we teach that there is one will, that the space between your will and the will of God is a higher concept. There is, in fact, only one will, because your true will is the will of God. That there is no real self that has any will that is other than that will. That your highest idea and ideal for yourself is the spiritual will. Charles Fillmore puts it like this in the book Christian Healing. He says, "The perfect man is produced by rounding out the will and joining it to understanding. The idea of giving up the will to God's will should not include the thought of weakening it or causing it to become in any way less. It properly means that the will is being instructed on how to act for the best. The will is being instructed on how to act for the best." Now, isn't that a more expansive concept than thinking there is a part of us that has a will that counteracts, that acts against, that pulls us away from our good, pulls us away from our God? That in fact, no, that is just an untamed thought, an untamed spiritual faculty, a divine power within that can be lifted and taught and nourished, disciplined, in fact, to follow the instruction of the highest emanation of true will, which is the spiritual will. If you are fulfilling your own nature, if you are fulfilling that which it is to be you, to your highest in every moment, you are fulfilling the will of God. So when we talk about will, we do, in essence, need to talk about what is God. There's a book that I love that I've been teaching from. It's called I Am the Door by Paul Farini, and we'll be going to it a couple times today. But I want to start with this quote. He says, "God is not some abstraction, but a living presence in your life. It is the breath that animates all form, the ultimate inclusive understanding, the quintessential blessing of love on all things. That's the presence of God. Ernest Holmes, New Thought minister and writer, the author of Science of Mind, said this in the book Law and Love. We have discovered this in metaphysics, that we live, move, and have our being in what we call an infinite mind. An infinite mind, an infinite creative mind, an infinite receptive mind, an all-operative mind, an omnipotent mind, an all-knowing mind. And we have learned that the mind presses against us on all sides. It flows through us. It becomes operative through our thinking. This mind, it becomes operative through our thinking. We have learned that the human race, ignorant of the laws of this mind, ignorant of the power of our own thought, has misused it through that ignorance. We have abused that creative power of thought, and the human race has brought upon itself the thing which was feared, because all thought is law, and all law is mind in action. The words in which you speak today is the law which shall govern your life tomorrow. As the word which you speak ignorantly or innocently, consciously or unconsciously yesterday, is absolutely governing your life today. Pretty intense activity of law, is it not? It makes it a little more complicated than just lifting up a wish and saying, I want to do the will of God, or here I go, and then not claiming responsibility, right? Because this passage, this teaching, this law shows us that we are here to be emanations and expressions of what we call God, of what we call this divine mind. And that leaves us incredibly responsible, does it not? That leaves us incredibly responsible. It makes it so we can't just put in a ticket, we can't just check a box, we can't just show up for an hour a week and then go, it's all handled. But in fact, we have a really, really great responsibility, don't we? To consciously expand our awareness, to consciously activate our practice in every experience without exception. In every experience without exception. That is our charge. That is our activity. God mind, and the will of God. Sometimes, rather than following what we think is the divine will, we sit in the wilderness. The wilderness being that place of untamed, undisciplined, uncultivated thought, and the will of God being disciplined or cultivated thought, aware thought, conscious thought, awakened living. But we all in this human condition have that duality experience, the experience of going between that which is purposeful and that which may feel destructive or may feel untamed or may feel, in a way, uncultivated. Charles Fillmore talks about will and wisdom in the Revealing Word. He says that will and wisdom carry out the edicts of the I Am. They carry out the plan idealized in wisdom. Spirit breathes in man the knowledge necessary to give him superior understanding. It is when we have this superior understanding that we let go of a concept that we can do anything other than the will, the great will, the one will. Have you ever wrestled with a decision or with a moment in your life, either what to do, how to move forward, how to think, how to act, whatever it is, and you have fully with your own being said, I just want to do that which is whole or wholly the best. I want to move forward in the direction I'm intended to move forward in. I want to do that which I am here to do. And that's my only intention. Sweet Spirit, all around me, among us, within me, please show me this. Have you had that experience? A lot of times that experience can range. It can range anything from There's a lot of good options for my life, and which one's more vibrant, which one's brighter, all the way to there could be some really self-destructive and world-destructive, community-destructive, family-destructive, consciousness-destructive thinking and actions, or emancipation from them, freedom from them, right? There's that whole range of experiences in the human condition. There are things that put us in bondage to each other and to the carnal mind and to the ego. And then there are things that free us into love, free us into peace, free us to receive divine illumination in ways of splendor. That is the experience of looking at will. See, will is an intense and a magnificent divine faculty within every being. Every being is born with will and with the ability to direct that will. And that has to be nurtured. It has to be educated. It has to be directed. If it's not directed, you know that song, you got to serve somebody? It's a good song. You could Google it later if you don't know it. But that song, you've got to serve somebody. The will is like that. The power of will serve somebody or something. If we don't show it what to serve, it will serve illusion, separation, fear, or ego. But when we do show it what to serve, when we bring it into harmony with love, when we bring it into alignment with good, when we bring it into alignment with our God ideas, it will be one of the most powerful faculties that one has mastered on this plane. Because things unseen will come into fruition by the power of that will. And it is our birthright to be activating in accordance with this will. In Job, it says, "Thou shalt also decree a thing, and it shall be established unto thee." That shows our co-creative ability, that we are here as co-creators, as expressions of God, to be expressions of God in action. Charles Fillmore in the book Teach Us to Pray said, "God made man by the power of his word. God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness.'" We're not going to go into today, but that's one of my favorite passages because it goes by a lot of people's ears. Let me just make you a little uncomfortable and leave you with it, and maybe someday we'll pick it up again. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Did you catch it? We're not going to talk about it right now. By virtue of his spiritual origin and the power vested in him, man forms his words in the world in which he lives. Jehovah said, "Thou shalt also decree a thing, and it shall be established unto thee." Every word a man utters energizes the ether with a creative impulse that in due season brings forth its image and its likeness. This has to do with our purpose and our will, because we tend to make our purpose and the will more complicated than it needs to be. It's that simple. Our job here is to do the will and the work of Spirit. That is the highest will and the work that is uniquely designed and divinely inspired within each one of us from birth through life to the resurrection, to transcendence, to enlightenment. How clearly am I an expression of my I am potentiality? How clearly are we avenues through which the I am can express unhindered? That is our question. That is our calling. These decisions that we go to in the human condition trip us up along the way. But until we can step into the space where we recognize that those polarities are just toys, they're just games in the mind, that in fact that idea of, oh, but this could be God's will and that one's mine, and so which one should I do and how do I, until we keep wrestling with that within our own minds until it comes to a place of unification and clarity. Until that moment, then it can flower. we are sitting in a struggle of the ego mind, which is part of the human condition, which is fine. But we are here not to get tripped up along the way. We are here to each moment, each day, each week of our lives, each year of our expressions, to take every part of our experience, every time we think we've got it right or we've got it wrong, and recognize it all leads to an unfolding God consciousness. The good, the bad, the ugly, it all leads to the unfoldment of God consciousness. So then, once we know this truth, what are we here to develop? We're here to develop our discernment over these so-called choices, but I invite you into a practice that there's no such thing as a choice, that in fact a choice implies that there is a right or wrong, or implies a this or a that, and in fact, if we move into discernment over choice, discernment, then we walk life as an unfoldment and an uncovering, rather than a struggle, rather than a piecing together of two parts. That instead we surpass, and we bypass those experiences that trip us up along the way. And our journey then becomes a more grace-filled, fun way to evolve the God consciousness that was born in us, that has no opposite. So how do we discern? In a practical way. In a practical way, knowing that we have both our absolute spiritual self, and then we have these ideas that may wrestle with that say, oh, I'm separate, or I don't know which direction, I don't know what to choose, I'm not sure. Some things are bad or wrong in my life, some things are good. How do we sort through that? Well, let's look at some wisdom throughout the ages. Karl Menninger said this: the voice of the intelligence is drowned out by the roar of fear. It is ignored by the voice of desire. It is contradicted by the voice of shame. It is biased by hate and extinguished by anger. Most of all, it is silenced by ignorance. Our tools today are to recognize the no, the yes, and the sign that we've got it, and we're on the right track, right? Isn't that what a lot of humanity is looking for? The no, the yes, the sign that we've got it? Well, Karl Menninger got the no. If we look at that quote, it's brilliant. Whenever we're checking in on ourselves, checking in on our world, our systems, to say, are we getting it? Are we getting it right? And remembering, too, in consciousness, all things lead to God consciousness. The good, the bad, the ugly, all things lead to God consciousness. So there's no really being out of it, but we can certainly make it more difficult. We can certainly lengthen the amount of time it takes to get there. And we can certainly create a lot of suffering in the human condition, in our physical and our spiritual lives, when we don't act in accord with wisdom. When we don't take this personal will and absolutely know that it is merged with the divine will. I'm going to share his quote again. How can we test it? How can we know if we have a no? Not to move forward in a particular direction with a particular consciousness? The voice of intelligence is drowned out by the roar of fear. It is ignored by the voice of desire. It is contradicted by the voice of shame. It is biased by hate and extinguished by anger. Most of all, it is silenced by ignorance. So when we find ourselves in states of consciousness, separation states of consciousness that are filled with ignorance, fear, shame, anger, bias, hate, we can know that that is not our highest expression. That is not the most grace-filled road to awakening or to being more spirit on this planet, being more God. Share with you from Paul Ferrini some excerpts on this point. From the chapter on lifting the veil, he says this: an about face is necessary. You must turn to the place where God abides. You must find the place in you which is unconditionally aligned with love. You can't do this while you're blaming others or holding on to grievances, nor can you do it when you're feeling guilty or beating yourself up for making mistakes. Every moment that is in accord with that consciousness is just a moment to presence oneself, not to create from, not to make decisions from, not to move forward from, but to recognize when we are in those states of consciousness, we're in a healing state, not a creative state, a healing state. The creation is happening within. It's revealing the wholeness within. He goes on to say, all judgments of self and others must go. You must come to God empty, with open arms. He goes on to say in another passage, the true authority of your heart does not need to gain the approval of others, nor does it desire to please self at the expense of others. It is not drawn outward into other people's dramas, nor inward in an attempt to satisfy personal wants or needs. Call it God, call it your higher self, call it your Christ mind or your Buddha nature. Names do not matter. You access this authority through your stillness, your quiet acceptance of yourself and others, your profound willingness to be present. You sink through the superficial dichotomies of mind into the depth of your heart, of the heart. And there, not surprisingly, you meet God, not as other, but as self. In the silence, there is a single heartbeat. It cannot belong to anyone else, for there is no one else there. Yeah. I didn't make sure we ordered this book for the bookstore, sorry. We'll get it in there. It's a beautiful book. One more passage from Paul Ferrini. All of the answers you need can be found in the silence of your heart. You don't have to look to others for solutions or advice. When people come to you saying, I have this answer, send them politely away. The answer is just as toxic for you as your own judgment of the situation. Their answer is just as toxic for you as your own judgment of the situation. So that leads us to the second point. The second point is, how do we trust our own judgment of a situation? If there is a concept and a possibility that sometimes our own judgment of a situation could be toxic, how do we transcend that? How do we move beyond that into a judgment that is pure, a judgment that is sacred? Well, in the scripture it says, do not quench the spirit, do not despise prophetic utterances, but examine everything carefully and hold fast to that which is good. So it leads us to what the master teacher, Jesus, the great radical rabbi, did. He tested everything in consciousness, tested it. He didn't just take the inheritance of the laws and the religion and the world around him, the teachings around him. He pioneered. He examined everything carefully, and he held on to that which is good. And once he proved it in his life, he taught it and he shared it. Charles Fillmore said that we are here to exercise our individual will in wisdom, in love, and in understanding. The Buddha said it like this: do not believe anything simply because you have heard it. I'm going to share a little bit from this passage. You've probably heard this quote, and there's the quote that is most commonly attributed to the Buddha, and then there's a story of where this might have come from. Do not believe anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe anything simply because it is spoken or rumored by many. Do not believe in anything simply because it is found written in your religious books. Do not believe in anything merely on the authority of your teachers and elders. Do not believe in traditions because they have been handed down for many generations. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and the benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it. Now, looking more into that story, it looks like that story possibly comes from a time when a Buddha was passing through a village, and the people of the village had wise people, seers, knowers, pass through all the time and tell them, do this, do that. And they were asking the Buddha, well, how do we know who to follow? Whose wisdom should we trust, because one comes in here and says this, and another comes in there and contradicts and says that. So how do we know? And that quote that we got comes from the Buddha's answer, but it may have gone more like this. Don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability or by thought. This contemplative is our teacher. When you know for yourselves that these qualities are skillful, these qualities are blameless, these qualities are praised by the wise, these qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to the welfare, to happiness, then you should enter and remain there. That, my friends, is the second step, to test it. To test what comes to us, to see if it's reliable, to see if it's not just about one's own desires, one's own separate self-needs, one's own preferences, because we can't follow our spirit by just following the preferences of our separate self or our ego. We know where that leads. We have enough demonstrations to see the road and the results. Instead, our ideas, our ideals, our views have to be put into practice. And we must guard against our own limitations, the limitations of our own understanding, the little tricks in our own minds, and come up with the highest expression of self. Have you ever noticed that when you've been on the fence about a decision, and maybe you've experienced that pull between what you would say is your personal will and the will of God, that there is a part of you in that mental or spiritual conversation, there was a part of you that could feel the difference and could feel an argument was happening, that a reasoning was happening, that in fact there was something inside, something in a voice, reasoning with the highest possible solution or answer. How do we know we're in line with the will of God? The will of God doesn't reason. It doesn't reason. When we come to that space, we feel reasoning, we feel the pull. That's just the pull of the separate mind, the separate ego saying, arguing. Ooh, but that's too big for me. Or, ooh, I have to be too selfless to be there. Or, oh, I'm not fully getting that. I don't know if that's going to fulfill all of my human desires. What I really wanted is this kind of money, this kind of place, this kind of thing, this. And I don't know if I give all that up, who am I going to be? That's not the sound of spirit. That's the sound of the ego. The will, the divine will, does not reason. So we've got the no and we've got the yes. You get it when you get the yes? All signs lead to God. All signs lead to light. But what is the sign? Martha Smock, in her book Halfway Up the Mountain, said, when we give way to God, there is never a letdown. There is always a lifting up. When we give way to God, there is never a letdown. There is always a lifting up. The sign is that when we are following our highest will, the one will, it makes us unfold. It makes us expand. We come alive, and we are here to our purpose. We're here and alive to our purpose, to express God. When that happens, you know it. And the compulsion, the spiritual impulse, is to do nothing else but that will, because it is the one thing you know you can do, and it is the only real purpose to life. And when we can abandon ourselves to becoming fully and truly alive, we know we are one in divine will. Namaste.